Uh, I think we are good to start now. Anirban? Most of our speakers and contributors and also many participants have joined already. I think we can start with the program. First of all, very good evening to all of you. We are very happy and excited to have you all here for this special panel discussion on our I think we are good to start now. Anirban? Book, Women's Voices, Representation and Resistance. For both of us, Anirban and me, most of our speakers and contributors and also quite special many participants joined already. Now that it started with reaching its readers, we are both nervous and excited to receive feedback from various avenues. And to begin with our program, first of all, we'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our esteemed and special invited speakers for today's panel discussion. We welcome Professor Saugata Bhaduri, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Professor Nandini Bhattacharya, Bardwan University, Professor Sukalpa Bhattacharjee, Northeastern Hill University, and Professor Maroona Murmu, Jadavpur University. We are very privileged to have the special speakers with us today, and we are positive that their discussion and views would bring forth many interesting insights and meaningful criticism that would touch upon not only subjects and issues raised in our book, but would also evoke and initiate important discussions and conversations, and would enrich and explore subjects that would go beyond the immediate scope of our book. We welcome we are very happy to welcome actually Mr. Sachin Rastogi, the publishing head and owner of Worldview Publications. Mr. Rastogi has played a very key role in bringing this book to its present shape and structure. We are fortunate to have him with us today. We are also very happy to welcome all our contributors who have contributed many essays, various essays for this volume, and without whose participation and collaboration, perhaps this book would not have been possible. We are also very happy to welcome all our participants who have joined us for this program, teachers, colleagues, researchers, and students. And we look forward to having an immensely illuminating, enriching, and meaningful discussion, interaction, and conversation ahead. To begin with our program, we'd first like to invite Mr. Sachin Rastogi to speak a few words about the beginning of this book, the beginning of the concept, our collaboration together, and its course to the publication of the book. So now I invite Mr. Sachin Rastogi to share his views.
Hi, Suranjana, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible. Yes, you're audible.
Yeah. Hello, everyone, and happy Holi to all. I hope these last 2 days must be very, you must have celebrated the festival. Very special day for discussion on women's writing as today is International Women's Day. Suranjana has already thanked. I also like to thank all the speakers, Professor Saugata Bhaduri, Professor Nandini Bhattacharya, Professor Sukalpa Bhattacharjee, and Professor Murmu and others who are part of today's discussion. Special thanks to Anirban and Suranjana for putting in the hard work and effort for the book. It has been a very long journey for the book, like started in 2021 immediately after the pandemic, but there were constant discussion among us between Suranjana, Anirban and me how to bring out the book to its present shape. But the way in between, Suranjana also had some problems, but she always kept on thinking about the book only, which was great on her part. I won't be speaking a lot what is inside the book because there is going to be a discussion. But what I'll wish to thank all the contributors who have been part of the book, and a special thank to our team who has been very integral to the formation of the book, especially our editor Neha Jaji Verghese and the uh, composing and designing, which is done by Tanya. She is very good. She designed the cover. I hope you liked it. It will also give me an opportunity to thank all our editors who have been part of Worldview, especially women. Worldview publication has 80% women editors. They give us a rock like support since we started in 99. They have always shown us a path and way ahead too. We have once again started doing a lot of critical essays for the students because we felt that there's a paucity of good critical material available to students at an affordable price. We did an excellent volume on film studies, then we did a volume on Beloved, and another volume on diaspora. And forthcoming will be our book on Indian writing in English and an important study on Tamil Dalit fiction. What I believe pandemic has changed reading habits and the students are more interested in PDFs and online material as compared to printed books. We still have a commitment to print and publish books at prices that student can afford. There will be ideas and opinions up for discussion on the topics in the book as evening progresses. We wish more and more students should be part of such discussions as it will help them to understand the nuances of the paper and women's writing as a whole, and probably better sales for us too. Just to bring up an interesting point, my father-in-law is a philatelist, and we discuss history of a place and country and even cultural events in terms of stamps. The first stamp issued on Mary Wollstonecraft was in the year 2009, almost 200 years after the publication of Vindication. There is still a lot of scope for women representation in mainstream, and we wish to close that gap in future years by bringing more books on women's writing. I also apologize to all the contributors who have not received their copies of the book. They will be getting it soon. I now invite Professor Murmu to go ahead with the discussion, please.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to hold this panel discussion. And Bhaduri, as I call him from my JNU days, it's an honor to be here with you on the same platform. So, Bhaduri, since you've written the foreword, would you kindly tell us a few things about the book that you found significant?
Yes, sure. So this is quite an interesting volume, and on several grounds which I've pointed out in my foreword. First of all, the fact that this particular volume almost resolutely wants to foreground once again and talk about the category of the woman. That itself is very significant because, as I've pointed out in my foreword, that more and more, especially in these non-binary times, especially in these times when we want to move away through very fabulous post-humanist and post-gender understandings of who we are, we slowly have begun in academic discourse to almost deconstruct and do away with the category of the woman itself, at least woman with a capital W, because we have started problematizing a notion that primarily emerges from a very binary notion of gender. But this particular book does not fall into that lure. And that was the first point that I've made in my foreword, that rather than fall in for that post-humanist and post-gender lure where woman itself as a category becomes a passé category, something that need not really be talked about because it can amount to a fetishization of some kind of gender binarism, this book chooses to resolutely stick to this category, and it's worth holding on to. And this category is not a category. The woman is still a relevant category. It's not a category that we can just wish away in our fabulous post-humanist, post-gender presumptions. And especially on Women's Day, as Sachin Rastogi has pointed out, it's fantastic that this volume sticks to this category of the woman. A second point, which I also thought that this book, this particular volume, is very, very significant, is that as far as women's movements are concerned, of course, the woman as a category still exists, but more and more, especially over the last few decades, and understandably, and also an issue that Sachin Rastogi referred to, because the way we have moved on from print or moved away from print, the bulk of women's movements around us over the last few decades have either primarily been fought on the streets, which is a wonderful thing, which is a very, very good thing, or have been fought on the cyberspace through digital media, through digital engagements. So the terrain of women's movements, the terrain of women's resistance, if at all woman as a category still exists, has primarily moved on to the digital domain and to the real street activistic domain rather than print. And this particular book resolutely sticks to print sources. All the articles that comprise this particular volume are about print discourses that were articulated originally in print. So this particular investment of this particular volume in a medium that some may say is an old medium, some may say is a medium that doesn't really matter anymore, or some may say is a medium that women's movements has moved away from. But the fact that this particular book resolutely sticks to print as a medium and discusses in one article after the other discourses that were articulated in print is again a very welcome sign, and without again fetishizing print as the legitimate medium of academic discussion, but that we must not forget a long history of how struggles have been framed through what may be an old medium today, but a medium that is still worth holding on to, is something that this book also scores on. And then there is a third register on which this particular book also becomes extremely significant, because when we do talk about women's movements, or any movements for that matter, any social movement, there is an attempt on our part, or there is some sort of an, what should we say, but there is an easy way out for us to make it as presentist as possible, to make it as much as emerging from our here and now, our spaces, our times. And yet, as we understand, without going through the long durée, the long history of women's movements as they framed themselves, and not just in the presentist metaphysics of presence-driven here and now, but in other spaces, at other points of time, without going into that, we are not likely to understand what women's movements should be like. And this is where also this particular book scores. So rather than only talking about contemporary women's movements in the contemporary subcontinent, it deliberately chooses to take a trans-temporal, trans-spatial route, rather than locating itself in such presentist here and nows. And therefore, we can jump to Mary Wollstonecraft, we can get driven through early 20th century discourses, we can easily take up, as this volume does, theorizations on women's writing by Derrida and Sexu. We can easily take up authors like American authors, like Emily Dickinson, like Sylvia Plath, and yet without giving up on intersectionality, without really locating ourselves therefore in a northern discourse of the woman with a capital W. It also chooses to locate itself in the subcontinent, and we're also variedly, rather than locating itself in one space and one time, we can kind of flit from Rashasundari Devi to Noti Binodini to Pandita Ramabai to even contemporary intersectional cases like Baby Haldar and Baby Kamle, and take up the Northeast in itself through Mamang Dai and Isterin Kire, and yet touch upon Indian writers in English like Kamala Das and Eunice D'Souza, and also take up the monumental presence of Mahashweta Devi. So the fact that this volume deliberately, and one may think eclectically, touches upon figures from different times, different spaces, that itself is also a very important point that this book makes, rather than catching us and almost encapsulating us only in the here and now, only in what currently concern us. So on all these three counts, this book makes a fantastic intervention, and which I thought, and I have underscored in my foreword, is something that this book ought to be taken seriously about, because it does give us that kind of a plethora of possibilities of dealing with the category of the woman in print medium, across cultures, across times, across spaces, because that may give us a far more robust notion, a robust weapon, as it were, to sharpen our absolute need for a continued resistance on grounds of gender. So that is what I have pointed out in my foreword.
Okay, so I'd like to ask you a few questions now, and I have
কি
worked
করছিস
on
বাবু?
Bengali women who've written in the 19th century, and we've seen how in the second half of the 19th century there are about 310 books which were authored by women writers, which have been officially categorized as art under art, biography, drama, fiction, history, language, poetry, philosophy, religion, science, travel, and Bengal Library catalog of books. We've also had literary critics. We also had authors uh, who saw multiple editions of their writings, like Shona Kumari Devi, Grija Sundari Devi. Now, mm, I feel that it was the negotiation with hegemonic discourses on literary worth, redeployment of traditional values, and experimentation with modern possibilities by these feminist foremothers that inspire us today to write a complex history of contestation, resistance, subversion. Now, Bhadrina, what do you think about the politics of writing as an act of resistance? Would you like to uh, tell us briefly about women's fashioning of the self and the forms of writing she engages in recent times? As we said, we've had a geographical and temporal sweep in this work. So, what's your opinion on these?
Yeah, writing indeed was one of the primary means through which women could insert themselves into a discourse that would have otherwise been absolutely androcratic. And writing, therefore, and of course, I mean, there's an article in this particular book directly about women's writing as theorized by the likes of Siksu and Derrida, the whole idea of écriture féminine. So, writing now, a century and a half beyond the period, after the period that you've been talking about, in the subcontinent, that would have been the period when women's writing would have emerged with any amount of seriousness. It may seem to us a bit passé, in the sense that, of course, women write, so what's the big deal? But right at the beginning, and in the European context, one could draw this history a century and a half even before that, from at least the mid 17th century onwards. The fact of writing, the act of writing itself was a subversive act when it came to the woman. And also the moment you write, since writing in itself also in a way takes your discourse away from the presentist here and now, yourself, and makes it available publicly, it also became a means for the woman to make herself, almost her body which she was writing out, available to the public. And we see this tension, this absolute tension we find in the writings of several early English authors, this continuous tension that should I let my writing reach the public domain? Because in that case, would it not be akin to either woman whom supposed to stay indoors, whom supposed to, kind of have a certain modicum of modesty attached to me? Would not that amount to almost, and Fanny Burney, for instance, writes in one of her prefaces to Evelyn, actually, that now that my writing has reached the public domain, any common man can leaf through me. It's almost like I am letting myself out into the public domain and kind of rendering myself at the disposal of the general masculine public. But in spite of that, in spite of these social constraints, and precisely because of this particular presumption that women would still take up against all social restrictions. The whole idea of writing and write despite all opposition, that is a very, very important point. So you've rightly pointed out that without writing and inserting oneself through writing onto a predominantly androcratic, predominantly hegemonic discursive domain, maybe much of what we now think of as women's movements wouldn't have happened. And currently also the fact that women keep on writing, I mean, though I said that it may seem passé, but it's not without much, let's say, hardship that women get to write by themselves. And everyone, I mean, I cannot just mansplain it to an audience that would know it, the female members of the audience who would know it much better than I can. So indeed, writing itself is a subversive act, and women taking to writing and daring to let them become public, come out, as it were, that itself was a momentous counter-hegemonic act in itself.
Yeah. Coming to the next question. So we've seen how there are Dalit women who've been taken up, women from the Northeast who have been taken up. So for you, how important is intersectional approaches in feminist pedagogy and politics in India today?
Yeah, intersectionality is absolutely important. I mean, we cannot really talk about this whole idea of woman with a capital W and feminism with a capital F. I mean, it has been already debunked over the last half a century or so. And we need to necessarily talk about the intersectional existence of other markers that any woman contextually has to continuously counter. And needless to say, this particular volume does build up on this notion of intersectionality, in spite of it being transtemporal, starting right from, as I've pointed out in my foreword too, starting right from even canonical authors like Catherine Mansfield, who being from New Zealand already belongs to the other, so to say, of the typical Northern Anglo-American space. So even with canonical authors like Catherine Mansfield, one can see so, and it becomes even much more intersectional when it takes up Baby Haldar, Baby Kamle, or so many other writers. So intersectionality is rife over this entire volume, and intersectionality is definitely something that is extremely important, and this volume does not compromise on that. But what I also wanted to point out, and I've pointed out in my foreword too, is that in the name of intersectionality, almost often we become so hyper-localist that we end up compromising even the category of the woman, because when intersectionality takes over the category, the basic notion of this gender difference, then somehow we, in the name of intersectionality, end up compromising the category of the woman. And that is something that this book doesn't do. So this book, in a way, very nicely, because of the articles that it presents, because of the article that it compiles, it very nicely balances itself across both these poles. Without, dilettante, anything goes, so it's all open, there is nothing like the woman, there is only intersectionality. It does not believe in that. It resolutely holds on to the category of the woman. And yet, it does not fetishize that woman with the capital W by deliberately injecting so many different kinds of women's writings emerging from so many different intersectional paradigms. So in a way, it very cleverly and very nicely and most welcomingly balances both. And intersectionality, I repeat, is very, very important, as long as in the name of a total hyper intersectionality, we don't totally undo and completely give up the category of gender itself and the category of the woman itself. And this book manages to actually do both.
Thank you, Bhaduri, for your intervention. If time permits, I'll come back to you. Now I'll move on to Nandini. Are you there, Nandini? Can I see you? Yeah. So welcome, Nandini. Please unmute yourself, Nandini. We can't hear you yet.
Hello, Saugata. Hello,
Hello.
Hello, Anirban.
Yes. Yeah. Nandini, you've written about Rashundari Devi, the first modern autobiography written in Bengali. So we'd like to know about your views on the shift shifting paradigms of feminine writings as such and moods of feminist movements, particularly in India, beginning from Rashundari et al. To Moshita Devi, Baby Kamli, Baby Haldar, Kulani Thakurchara, Lili Haldar, Krishna Korati of the present times.
Right. Uh, anyway, thank you for having me. The See, I mean, there are two things that I have looked at in this book, and I will take up from where Saugata has ended, that the very question of writing is seminal. At least in the 19th century, it is seminal because writing or reading is not something that the marginal has access to. So when we are talking about the woman, we are also talking about the several marginal groups that don't have access to writing or reading for that matter. And I have quoted from one of the lesser read of Vidyasagar's tracts. It came out in a very Benthamite kind of journal called Sharboshukhukori Putrika, Happiness for All, where he says that the little chance that a young man and a young woman have of education and of making themselves human is lost when they are married off early. Ballo Bibahet Dosh. So they remain human only in form and not in essence. So the fact that education, writing and reading is one way of making the human was something that was becoming increasingly important, increasingly evident to the entire world. I mean, this would be a time which I would call a moment of educational turn, because in Germany, in Switzerland, in Scotland and England, new ways of more and more marginal groups, the working classes, the various kinds of marginal groups, not necessarily women, were being brought into the ambit of writing, reading, and what we call a sort of Foucauldian revolution of a learner-centric, self-induced reading, writing becomes the norm. So to see writing and reading for women must be seen within this larger global or transnational ambit, and this must be understood also in terms of global trade. This has to be understood that the knowledge texts that were being produced in England, in Britain primarily, and to an extent in Scotland, these had a wide market, and even the techniques had a wide market of reading and learning by oneself, had a wide market both in erstwhile colonies like the North Americas. For example, the Owenite, New Lanark experiment, which was taken up by the much discredited phrenologist George Combe, became the basis for workers learning in the state of Massachusetts. So today, if you look at people like Horace Mann, so U.S. education system, at least in the East Coast, is largely indebted to the Scottish experiments in reading and writing. And reading and writing were again thought to be something that makes one human. So when I find that sort of similar, a lateral experiment is going on, almost at the same time, you see, at around between 1850 to 1860, maybe in a 5-year lag, I find that colonial Bengal is not just a passive receptor, but in fact producing many of these reading, writing efforts or initiatives. And as you well know, in the case of Lancaster, the Madras model became a model that was later reintroduced in the reading, writing processes in Britain and primarily in Scotland. So the fact that the whole idea of object lessons, the fact that you could actually see something and you could hold that and you could say that this is round or long or flat or rough. These became transnational ventures of making the human. Now, when I say making the human, I'm acutely aware that the educational turn was at a moment when the Chartist movement was knocking at the doors. There was severe working people's unrest. And in the case of Bengal, there was also the severe threat of, or at least that is how Devendranath and Vidyasagar, the whole group, I mean, Akhay Chandra, they saw it as a threat of Hindu women being converted to Christianity because of one very important conversion about which all of you know. So the question of teaching women to read and write was also a Diokinchit Nakuriyo Bonchit, kind of in a social inclusion movement. A social inclusion movement which continues today, which continues. We tend to push the envelope. We tend to, to push the boundaries when we include someone like Baby Kamble or someone who is a working maid, when we include more and more women who are writing. Therefore, I see women as one among many who have this opportunity or who are given this opportunity at a particular time to write and become human, to read and become human. And since I have worked on Rashundari, there are just one or two things that I'd like to say. That Rashundari's writing is remarkable because, you see, it's remarkable because she has conquered the word. Without the word, she is not even human, let alone a woman. And therefore, I mean, for me, feminism has always meant humanism, some another way of extending the boundaries and the opportunities of becoming human. Now, I'm not being idealistic here. I'm not being idealistic. I'm aware of a biopolitical pertinence that allows such movements to happen and such boundaries to be pushed and extended. But nevertheless, even within that, I feel that a great deal of change happens in how we perceive a human being. And in Rashundari's case, see how many ways in which the logic of ordering, the way in which she has been presented. First, her son, Shoroshi Mohan, I think, he prints the book with their own money, and she also says that the profit from the sales must be spent for Radha Madhav. So she is aware that the book is a commodity and that it will actually make some money. So again, this is remarkable, and I would again like to place it within that knowledge economy where books are important commodities, where reading in itself is something that has some capital return. I mean, when Madan Mohan Tarkalankar in his Shishu Shiksha says, Gari Ghora Chore Jei, Lekhapara Kore Jei, Gari Ghora Chore Shei. I mean, this is a very consequentialist kind of philosophy, but it is actually a repetition of something that people like Coombe would be saying, or Owen would be saying that, if you study hard, you are going to have success. I mean, in fact, Coombe says something absolutely similar in the Constitution of Man. So this connection between reading, writing, or discovering the word, and discovering the word as capital, is something that was inevitable at this point of time. I mean, this is how I would see Rashundari's coming into her own. Now, it is also true that Rashundari belongs to a Vaishnav family where reading and writing, and Vaishnav women have been at the forefront of reading and writing. And my one thing that I thought that somebody should write a sequel to Tonikati's book is the intertext of Chaitanya Bhagavat so far as Amar Jivan is concerned. I also have contested the fact that Jivan and Chorit, the difference that Bhattarcherjee makes, is untenable, because Rashundari talks about her life as Jivan Chorit in several times. So, I mean, I wouldn't make so much about a masculine Chorit and a feminine Jivan or a Katha, because these were often interchangeable categories. And it was not so different that the woman did not know the price of her work. The fact that it was a commodity that had some market value, at least Rashundari did. And I mean, so did Kailashvasini. I mean, because she collaborated with a publisher husband, and there were specific sales of the book about which she was aware. So the book was an emergent commodity, and the woman writing and reading was one way of, as Woolf would say, finding a profession for women. I mean, finding one way in which a woman could come into the market, as it were, the knowledge market. In fact, the woman had an advantage of her having a niche, or at least of her having, see, somebody like, say, Rokeya. I mean, it was so much more simple because Rokeya was a woman and she was a Muslim woman. It is these distinctive sort of niche areas that make her works more prominent, as it were. Now, the other thing that I would agree with Saugata is that, I mean, when the book is rediscovered by Dinesh Chandra Sen, first by Jyotirindranath Thakur, it is about how intimate and how feminine it is, and how akritrine or simple it is. But, you know, if you read the book carefully, it is not simply about winning the word as an interiorized act. At the end, Rashundari is saying that she even read some letters when her husband was away, and she was able to solve a zamindari court case. So she not only won the word as an interiorized devotional act, but she also won the word to win the world of politics and business. So there is something like a justified pride, which I discover in that part of the end part of Rashundari, which is not so Vaishnavachita, where she says that had I not read that letter, so much of the zamindari would have gone away. So, you know, when we try to decipher, when Jyotirindra says that, all right, she is a woman and her writing is akritrine, I believe that Jyotirindranath wants to make a category. It's an organizing principle. After all, we are all in the production of knowledge texts, knowledge values. So according to Jyotirindranath, this was a new kind of writing, which was akritrine, which was from the heart, and it was about the woman, where the Hindu man could find his last refuge, being kicked and, you know, slapped about in the world of commerce. But this itself was a commercial activity. It wasn't outside commerce. Secondly, the Rabindranath actually takes up this model of the woman's writing versus the man's writing, not only in Nostoni, which all of us are aware of. There are two important writers. One is Amol and one is Bhupati. Bhupati fails in his newspaper writing business, and Amol fails in his creative writing business. So there is the good writer, the potent writer, that is Chalu, who is able to express herself. Now, is this merely because she is a woman, or is it because she has been able to tap that desire, that very romantic desire for the Okritrim, for something that has not been tapped before? And obviously there is a jibe at the Bonkim kind of writing, which is public, which is oratorial, which is historical and large framed, and one is talking about the grand receipts vis-a-vis the sort of faith diverse, the micro narratives, the little nothings, which have another kind of valence. And finally, when we come to someone like, I would say that both when Jyotirindranath is recording Lalon, or Jyotirindranath is showcasing Rashundari, he is doing more or less the same thing. He's trying to bring some marginal voices and trying to create some knowledge packages, some packages which would be, which were innovative, which were new, which were areas that had not been explored. So apart from that, the later ways in which this book has been feted is by Ghulam Murshid, who had an access to the British Library. And therefore Ghulam Murshid brings in another perspective of the Bengali woman. Not only the woman by which Jyotirindranath and Dinesh Chandra Sen would possibly mean the Hindu upper caste woman, but the woman as anybody who writes in Bengali, and by which he could add people like Rokeya. So from Rashundari to Rokeya is the organizing principle of Ghulam Murshid's book on Rokeya, and that is also a very important book, Hajar Bochorer Bangali Nari, and he has these titles, this organizing principle of a worldwide Bengali community of women writers. You can create several such organizing principles. You get PhDs for having a fine organizing principle. Muslim women writers, Dalit women writers, worldwide women writers, so Bengali women writers. So interestingly, of course, it preceded the birth of Bangladesh. So the question of Bengali-ness and who writes in Bengali and the woman who is a Bengali becomes a global issue rather than being the issue of the subcontinent. So finally, when Tonikadi comes to write about this book, the 19th century has become a very important area of South Asian studies in the east coast of US. And Partha Chatterjee and Tonika Sarkar, they write back to back. And Tonikadi is to be feted for having translated some parts of the book, though she has not translated those parts which I find very interesting. Those parts at the end where I find not Vaishnavachito Daya or humility, but some sort of pride that I can write. I can write and I can resolve problems of the world. I find this pride to be excellent because it is what makes a woman and it is what makes a writer. After all, it is by writing that one becomes what one is. Without telling one story, one is always condemned to be in other people's stories. I mean, I'm borrowing this from Amitabh Ghosh, but definitely, I mean, one is invisible if one is not writing. So there is plenty of self-reflexivity in the writings of the most marginal of people who are of women who are writing, and I see them within the category of marginality while agreeing to and while being acutely aware of an overarching patriarchy and the need for women, more and more women, to write about themselves, to read and write about themselves. But finally, I think Tonikadi's book, which is where I would like a little more of reading into the and I hope sometimes, I mean, I have many hopes, but I mean, none of them fructify. But I hope that sometimes I can actually show the kind of efforts that the Chaitanya Bhagavat actually speaks of regarding writing. Gongaiya Gongaiya Purila. And Gongaiya is a word that is often taken out of context to say, look how difficult it was for Rashundari to study, to read. But it is actually taken chock-a-block from Chaitanya Bhagavat. So, and the fact that the God can read, and it is by the God's divine grace that one can read, is something that is not entirely about divine visions, but about actually reading Chaitanya Bhagavat and sort of copying from there, taking bits and pieces from there. So there are times when the Lord is not able to read. That's one of his leelas. And then there is a teacher where he beats the teacher hollow and he reads everything. So these are things that one needs to again sort of go over. And well, I mean, I guess reading and writing for women is very important. Is very important, and I congratulate Anirban and his team for having brought out this volume, because if you do not write, you are invisible. So reading is important, writing is important, and Rashundari, I guess, is an interesting example of various ways in which a woman could be appropriated or her writing could be seen. And I think that story sort of continues.
Thank you, Nandini Di. And hearing you, I could remember, since I've gone through Bengal Library catalog of books, I could see that there's a proof of readership and market for books written by women. And if one goes through the price list of books and the print runs, one does not find a clear indication of disparity in price of books based on gender. So I think women were aware that their books had a market of their own. And before I move on to Sukalpa, a very last question to you. You were talking about a larger framework about Lancaster and the print culture and material book as a form of material culture. Is there a sense of globality inherent in autobiographies written specifically in regional, local languages and from margins?
You see, I mean, at least in the 19th century, you couldn't avoid a globality. You have to understand that reading and writing was largely a Scottish Presbyterian affair. I mean, I'm quoting. It was something that had a direct sort of come and go between Edinburgh, between the cheap presses by which writing, books could be made incredibly cheap. In fact, Coombe became so popular, in fact, the third bestseller, The Constitution of Man, because the two Chambers brothers, especially Robert Chambers, who wrote Vestiges, he had brought down the price of the book to a minimum. Also, the prints were smaller. So books now become something that people want to read, and they are available. They are made cheaper. They are made cheaper. Their packaging, the way in which so in the 19th century, ours. I mean, we are today far more restricted after independence, in the sense that we do not have a robust or a vibrant communication with the rest of the world, unless one is incredibly privileged. I mean, one is at the sort of, centers of education. But the fact that the various European educators were actually operating in India at that point of time would make it a natural shanglap, a sort of dialogue. So I don't think that you can avoid the question of globality. You cannot avoid it today as well, but there is a way in which I can say that, oh, I'm a writer in West Bengal, and maybe Sachin Rastogi is going to publish me, so there will be a Indian audience. But to be ensured of a global audience, at least an Anglo-American audience, and most of these books would be translated into French or German, would ensure a much larger market. So for all the evils of colonization, this I think was a good thing.
Thank you, Nandini Di. I might come back, as I said, if I have time. So I'll move on to the next panelist, Professor Sukalpa Bhattacharya. Are you there? Yeah. Good evening.
Hello, good evening. Thank you.
Hi. One of the interesting things about the book is that it deals with voices from the Northeast. Since we in this part of India, and we know how we look into the Northeast, would you tell us something about the distinctive significance of women's voices from India's Northeast?
Thank you, Dr. Murmu, and hello, everyone. And very nice to listen to Saugata and Nandini Di after a long time, and meeting them virtually. And I'll just take on from where one thread from Saugata and one thread from Nandini Di in trying to locate the writings by women in Northeast. First of all, a woman is not a homogeneous category, and the issue of her diverse intersections with caste, class, ethnicity, sexualities, all this can be traced to the history of feminist thought, where we have seen that a woman primarily has to overcome the snare of silence, and it is here that her appropriation to the male dominated genre of writing, such as autobiography, in spaces where she has been totally kept away from because she does not have an autobiography. She's absolutely denied. But the ironical part with the history of women's writing is that we have not yet been able to problematize this issue of women's writing. The first problem is about how is a category called women's writing born? And basically, these rubrics come from the publishing houses, because women's writing, meaning women who have been able to publish their work, is not the same as women writing. There have been women writing all over. We are talking about Rasundari Devi, 19th century. Around the same time, even in Northeast, there have been women who have been writing. For example, in 1884, you have someone called Padmavati Devi Fukunani, who wrote a novel called Sudharma Upakhan, or in Assamese it would be Khudormar Upakhan. And this novel is hardly known anywhere. And the year of publication, and why this publication became possible, it is because of the intervention of the missionary wives who were connected with the print culture that was born in Sipsagar, because they initially, the missionary wives who came as helpmates with the colonial masters, basically did not intend to be in Assam. They wanted to go to Bhutan, but in Khotia they set up a station, and there the print culture. And then you have the birth of a journal called Urunodoy. And so, if one has to trace the history of women's writing in Northeast, one has to go back to the early writings by these missionary wives, whose entire project was quite different from the project of their husband or the masters or partners with whom they had come. They had come as helpmates. The same story is also in the Khasi Hills, that Thomas Jones, who first came and gave the Roman script to the Khasis, the women who came along with them are the women who work outside of the structure of missionary activities. It is they who entered into personal contact with women, taught them hygiene, issues of women's health, reproductivity. So one of the early writings that you find are writings from missionary wives, but that is not something very known, and it's only now that scholars are falling back upon. This brings me to the other point about the recovery. How do we trace a tradition or a project by Ellen Showalter, Virginia Woolf, which had begun, in the Western context, the whole idea of defining a female tradition in literature, starting from 1840s and 1920s and later, this actually becomes the project of recovery of women's intellectual history. And it would not be possible in Northeast or elsewhere to trace the history of women's writing without falling into the history of women's struggles and the building up of collective action. So recovery of women's writings is not really going back to the writings of our mothers and grandmothers, as Ellen Showalter would say, or appropriate the hand-me-down male tradition of literature. It is not limited to that. It is actually about recovery of the emotional history, the intellectual history of women. And it is here that also the intervention of women of Northeast lies. The next point is also the question about representation, the politics of publication, pedagogy. These are issues that are emanating. Now, if we look at how these writings happened, 1884, 1890s, we see a lot of vernacular texts by women in Northeast, but these texts in Assamese and in the context of the hill states, which these their Northeast frontier, there was also the loss of the written script. So there was also the privileging of the written over the oral. So there were writings in languages which were lost because the script itself was lost. So one had to start once again, beginning with the Roman script coming into the hills. In the context of Assam, what happened was the coming of colonial modernity was something that actually came from Bengal, because the first batch of Assamese intellectuals were those who were associated with the reformist movement in Bengal, and they came back. You have people like Gunobiram Borua, who wrote Ram Navami Natok in 1857, the time of Sepoy Mutiny. And it is here which is, he talks about, it is studied that it is about his daughter. And this daughter, who actually, traditionally, if one goes back, one finds she is Swarnalata. And who is Swarnalata? Who was supposed to be married to Rabindranath Tagore. But because Gunobiram Borua was associated with the widow remarriage, and Gunobiram Borua himself married a widow. So what basically happened was these issues were later taken up. And in around 1998, you find the Assamese novel by Tilottama Mishra, which is Swarnalata, which tries to bring in these concerns of colonial modernity, issues of female education. So all these are kind of brought in later in the 1990s. So it is very difficult in the context of Northeast to actually shape or map a terrain and call it a trajectory of women's writings. So one can go back to the writings that happened, and I see wonderful parallel that is happening elsewhere. For example, in 2008, two very important work. One is Mem Sahib's writings, an anthology which was published in 2008, Indrani Shen. And you find Aparna Basu and Malavika Karlekar in so many words. It is about 8 women from Eastern and Western India. In this entire project, the reason why probably Northeast is missing is the fact that it is not possible to retrieve. This is where the issue of recovery comes. That recovery of the intellectual history of women's writings. And it is only now that several scholars, I'm very happy to see even in JNU, many scholars from Northeast are working in these areas. And I have got the opportunity to see, for example, the role of missionary wives in the Naga Hills, in the Khasi Hills, in Assam. These have been important topics that have been taken up for research. And it is through these that we come to know of the immense contribution in the writings by Eliza Brown, who was the wife of Reverend Brown, then Mary Mead Clark, Jessie Traven Moore. So these are sets of women writers. But unfortunately, and I've argued it in my in some of my papers which have been published, that the whole rubric of Northeast literature or Northeast women's literature is a very, very fractured description, which is largely also a misrepresentation. And the reason for this misrepresentation is also the politics of borders and borderlands that exist in Northeast, and one does not have the scope to retrieve writings. For example, very little is known of the intellectual history of women of Surma Barak Valley, the southern part of Assam, which a lot of history was erased, and a lot of tension which persists today also falls back. Issues of citizenship, issues of land, issues of people, the legitimacy of the land over people because of different colonial designs. And there were women writing, and you have now we are able to revive materials on how women actually participated. Rabindranath had gone to Sylhet. You also have documents on how Gandhiji came to Silchar town, how there was a meeting, the issues that women raised, and these are several writings which also can be categorized in the category of women's writing. But one problem is also problem of language. We do not have adequate translation, and therefore these writings are not coming out. It's only now scholars have started working. So it's a very, very late process that have started. And the things, for example, imagine if Rasundari Devi's autobiography could be researched and studied in so many ways. Why is that we do not have a means to study Padmavati Devi Fukanani's work? We did have women writing at the same time. So I would like to say that, starting from 2020s, you find a new batch of, young creative writers who are getting interested in trying to compile. So when it comes to the question of women's writing in Northeast, one has to fall back upon dossiers and anthology. And we know that there, something that Nandini was just talking about, that how dossiers and anthologies organize work also has its own kind of a framework, which actually does not allow for the retrieval of the women's voice, nor the issues that actually come in the way of how she appropriated different stereotypes that had come in the way. So you have a work that was published 2019, 2020, The Many That I Am. This is Writings from Nagaland by Anungla Zol Longkumer, which actually looks at this whole paradigm of current writings that you find from women's writing from Nagaland. Again, from Manipur, you have Crafting the Word, Writings from Manipur, which actually goes back to literary movements. Now, what I want to say, what Nandini said, winning of the word is winning of the world. And writings from Manipur have been primarily in the area of activist writings. Primarily also because the socio political scenario that is there in Manipur, one of the most volatile states under the Armed Forces Special Power Act. And it is here that, sometimes, activists are poets and poets are activists. And it is here that you find Hirom Shormila writing so many poems, her long 16 years of fast against Armed Forces Special Power Act. So this is how the whole, paradigm of Northeast writings can be looked at. Temsula Au probably, and this is where, if this book by Suranjana, edited by Suranjana and Anirban, goes for a reprint, I would suggest that there must be something on Temsula Au, because she's one of the first to be recognized as a writer writing in English from India's Northeast. And this writing is extremely important because it defines the particular form of writing that is in practice now in Northeast, the source of which is ethnography. So defining oneself, her first ethnographic work, which is On Being Naga, which actually was published much later. In 2004, Temsula Au published This Hills Called Home, and there she talks about her own racial responsibilities to be able to tell the next generations the stories of the community. She means particularly the Au community, that so that the stories will not die. So there is a necessity, there is an urgency to allow stories to live on. And this anxiety is primarily because of the privileging of the written over the oral. Okay, so it is here there are many writers. Women have been writing. Women have been writing from various perspectives. For example, in Meghalaya itself, you have 5 translations of Gitanjali, and most of these translators are women. So it's very interesting to see that actually women have been writing, but they're coming in contact with Christianity, only allowed them the power of the word. And it is after that that these writings are finding expression. So Temsula Au's On Being Naga is also about on being a Naga woman, what it means to be a Naga and what it means to be a Naga woman. And from that, you find that there is a whole trajectory that comes, This Hills Called Home, where a number of stories are based on the experiences of women under insurgency. So women as community workers who build solidarity, falling back on collective action, women as armed soldiers, as companions, women as custodians of the traditional institutions, but women who are not allowed to be part of the traditional institutions, the diverse traditional laws that exist for men and women, the discrimination, the nature of ethnic patriarchy, and the various shades of patriarchates coming in conflict with each other, making women's life even more miserable. So the social history is extremely important in understanding the nature of writing. This whole stereotype, looking at the writings of Northeast as that which talks of violence, that's a kind of a misnomer. That's almost a cliche, and I think one needs to move away. The source of creative energy that is there in women's relationship with nature, her ecological existence, her need to redefine the race, her need for telling a story, her need for keeping herself and keeping the land and the environment is extremely important for redefining the self. For example, Temsula Au's last book before she passed away, Tombstone in My Garden, where you find several conversations happening between the grandfather tree and the child tree. What does it mean? That these conversations, the nature of which is mostly political, and these conversations are actually shown in ecological terms. So politics of representation, which is extremely important, particularly for women's rights, it has always been a kind of a challenge because sources for women's writing has never been in women's writing, it has been in other sources. So you find that one of the first volumes that was in 1993 by Suzy Tharu and Lalita, which they begin by where do we look for sources for women's writing? And the sources are not in written documents. Sources are not available in a chronological manner. So they talk about how through several social histories they were able to retrieve how from the 6th century BCE there were Terigata nuns whose resistant writings
রুটিটা
can be one of
বলেছো
the
নাকি?
earliest writings in women's writing if one has to go back to it. So similarly for India's northeast, this kind of writings cover a huge, unfortunately, for the syllabus that is prescribed
এটা কি খাও?
in many universities in the country and abroad, the manner in which texts are selected or not is it actually does not represent the map, the cultural map of India's Northeast, nor does it speak particularly with reference to women's writing. Eastern Kire, the whole basis of terrible matriarchy can be understood only when one understands the basis of Naga ethnography. So it's very important to understand the sources, also the how language travels, how the unrepresentable exists in the English language, which does not have a tribal or indigenous parallel. Professor Miral Miri, a philosopher, often talks about how the modern notion of time cannot be translated into the tribal notion of time. It is not a linear time. The issue of time, the issue of space, the issue of recasting of myth, which is so important for understanding the whole canvas of writings. And therefore, the latest anthologies that I was talking about, I'm not going into the problem of anthologies and dossiers, which is another problem, apart from the fact that the politics of the publishing house is also another. Suddenly, in the late 1990s, we find that there is sudden interest that metropolitan publishers start taking on the writings, some translated, English writings from India's Northeast. Prior to that, Northeast writers would go door to door to publishers. There were no takers for that. I know myself because I have worked with Temsulao. I've seen the birth of a writer, a senior person struggling to get a publisher till Zuban took it up and the first publication house. So we need to understand how women writers negotiate the power of the word, the appropriation of the word with body, the whole notion of how body is important, not only for writing, body is also important as a political weapon. And I think the Meitei mothers have shown us in the last movement. So there's a deep connection between politics of representation, appropriation of stereotype, activism, and also finally the question of pedagogy. How do we teach women's writings? Where do we begin from? Is it any text that can be taught? And one of the issues we have to deal with, and some questions that come, if there is nothing called men's writing, then why there is something called women's writing? And this is a question that one needs to negotiate, particularly because this book, which has been published edited by Suranjana and Anirban, it will go to students, and one needs to see how students will take it, which is the starting point to begin with. And so our problem, because of lack of material, lack of what should I say, recovery of what I said, emotional history, intellectual history, the lack in that gets reflected in our pedagogy. We don't know where to begin from, and what we give is a fragmented history. So it is a problem not only in the context of Northeast, in the context of any region, and there is always a kind of a sisterhood, that gets reflected. Writings around the same time, just think about it. Say for example, around the time when Ellen Showalter was building up this thesis, and prior to that, you had someone like Ellen Moore's literary women, which wanted to open up issues about how women, in order to become good writers, have to be good readers. So there is a need for opening up texts for feminist reading. So once again, there is a need for us to understand that feminist theory or feminist theoretical criticism is extremely necessary for us to understand the history of women's writing. Similarly, one cannot map the history of women's writing without going into the historical nuances of how one does it. So now you have topics on the themes, the thematic engagement, like grandmother's tattoos, advent of Christianity, tradition of morality, imposition of new language. These are the issues, and particularly issues of conflict, women as post-war, involved in post-war reconstruction. For example, women are never called, and the role of this immensely, powerful women's organizations, they also contribute. Many of these activists are writers, so these also fall into. So this whole notion about defining Northeast as an alien land, as a geopolitical locale, which is away, which only talks of insurgency and violence. These are some of the stereotypes that first of all need to be done away with, both from the point of publication and of our pedagogy and our research. That there is something more to look into it, and this is how I think we can actually do justice to this whole genre of women's writing from India's Northeast.
One last question coming from the place that you belong to and sort of state intervention that you've seen there for ages now. Now, and in the beginning, we've seen how feminine writing is a form of subversion resistance. Now, how would you relate it to the corresponding practices of resistance in late capital globalized world? Writings coming from your place, feminine writing coming from your place, and practices of resistance in late capitalized, globalized world?
I think the last bit of what I said a little before is that the writings that are emerging now are basically trying to appropriate this kind of representations. For example, women have been, particularly in India's Northeast, have been always spoken to. They have never been able to speak. So the whole agency now is to be able to speak of oneself. That this whole project of being looked at, the gaze that was there. And even now, the political claims that come out from India's Northeast, you find that on one hand, there is a need for doing away with the white ethnographers' representation of the indigenous woman. At the same time, the representation of women by quote unquote, which is called from the mainland, how the women of Northeast have been projected. I think there is a lot of attempt on the part, even of not only, this brings me to another question. What do we do about those forms of feminist articulations which are not available in print, but they are also important resistant articulations? How do we look at them? Probably only if we could find ways and means to kind of work and do research on this kind of different forms of articulation. For example, there are many myths which project women in a certain light, and these have been also, let's say, popularized by both Western ethnographers who came here, particularly the Welsh connection that is there. I'm talking about the Khasi Hills at the moment. So there is an attempt on the part of women writers to recast the ethnic, let's say, the interpretation of myths and oral traditions. For example, there is a very important work which is the myth of Nam. Okay, Nam. I'm talking of the Khasi Hills. And Professor Esther Siem, who is also a writer from this region, she has recast this entire myth of Nam. So in the original myth of Nam, Nam actually dies and she is not able to exercise her agency. But in this rewriting of this myth of Nam, you find here is Nam who is able to take a position at the end of the play. So this is how I think writers now are trying to appropriate or intervene at the level of representation of the stereotypical image of the indigenous tribal woman. That is something that is being appropriated by contemporary writers in Northeast. Another very important aspect is also a massive translation that scholars are engaged in at this moment, so that the stories of communities are not misrepresented. And you have more and more, you have many researchers who are probably first generation learner, who the moment one takes up a research project, one wants to make the stories of one's community heard to the rest of the world. So there is a desire for the stories to pass on, to be able to tell the stories. And this is something that is happening in a very big way, that myths are being rewritten. That reminds me of White Sargasso Sea, how this was an appropriation to Jane Eyre. So there is an attempt of rewrite the kind of ethnographers' notes and histories that have been done. We know of a lot of damage that was done by ethnographers in the Naga Hills, of the very funny anecdotes that they wrote about the local people, the tribal people. So there's a new attempt by researchers to question those anecdotes, which positions the local native in a certain way, puts them in this whole Orientalist discourse of how one perceives the other. So there is a conscious effort to do away with the otherization that happens at the level of writing. And this is something very important as far as India's Northeast writings are concerned.
Thank you so much, Professor Bhattacharjee, for your illuminating intervention. Suranjana, I think we've run out of the time that was given to us. Do we go in for a question answer session? Suranjana, are you there?
I think we can take up one or two questions now, and then we'll go on to the interactive.
I think there was a question in the chat box, in the sense Debojyoti Bishwash from Boruland wanted to ask a question. Could you please go ahead?
Hi, good evening.
Yeah, good evening.
Yeah, it's not actually a question. I wanted to make a comment. Good evening, respected resource persons here, Bhaduri sir, Nandini ma'am, and Sukalpa ma'am. It's nice being here and listening to your talks. I would like to make a comment here, and maybe you could respond to that. In pre-colonial societies, specifically in India, women were considered as the storytellers in many societies, even in Northeast India. And so far I remember, as a child, I used to listen to the stories told by my grandmother. So they were important storytellers in every household. And if I'm not wrong, during the early 20th century, it was the Thakumar Jhuli in Bangla and Burhiair Hadhu in Assamese, which made its appearance. So there also it was the centrality of the women telling the stories to us, whoever the publisher or the editor is, because we know this Burhiair Hadhu, it was published by Lakshminath Bej in Assam. So now we see that there is a shift when this print capitalism made its appearance and things were controlled, and who would produce and who would bring this out and who would control the ideas. It was from that time onward we can see there is a shift in controlling that agency, that women had been marginalized. That's what I am trying to say. And in this context, I would also like to state Chandra Talpare Mohante, in one of her articles, she has written about this, and I would quote, in the last 2 decades, numerous publishing houses in different countries have published autobiographical or life-oriented texts by third world feminists. This is a testament to the role of publishing houses and university and trade presses in the production, reception, and dissemination of feminist work. So I think it's the agency, or there should be some kind of platform which is offered to the women, through which they can disseminate their voices to empower them. And in Northeast India, if we see today, like Sukalpa ma'am has already stated, most of the storytellers from Northeast, the novelists of the 21st century, they are the women, and they are also using the myth, the stories which were available, and they are trying to reconnect to them through their recent novels which they are writing. But it does not mean that the Northeast Indian societies, the tribal societies, are not patriarchal societies, or they do not have discrimination against women. They do have, as their customary laws indicate. But what I want to say is that agencies like, or publication houses like the Zuban or the universities that offer courses on women's writing or promote women's writings. And in our university, we are offering Northeast writings in English, and it has a lot of texts by women. So these institutes and agencies, they can play a role in promoting the women's writing. So that is my observation that I would like to make.
Maroona, can I sort of respond to this one?
Yes, Nandini.
I mean, Devajyoti, I'm sort of, I firmly resist this whole business of women as storytellers and as repositories of some sort of traditional wisdom. Whenever one writes in within an organizing principle. Writing is never a unmediated and simple act. I mean, when one talks of women, and especially of Northeast, of women as repositories of some old tales, and even Thakumarjhuli, which was largely mediated, I think, this is where the problem lies. I mean, I wouldn't see any woman as a repository of a lot of stories. I mean, the Oldenburg manuscripts were not actually by women. They were the Grimm brothers, who were very much men, and other men involved.
Yes, ma'am. That is what
so I mean,
Devajyoti,
please, I would really sort of, I resist this with my every fiber of my being, about women being repositories of some traditional stories and sitting around, log fires protecting those stories. I mean, they take us back to certain essentialist images about women writing. Writing is a complex process. I mean, you have to accept that writing is a complex process and involves certain amount of self-reflexivity. A simplicity is not always a matter of being simple. It's a matter of being fairly complex.
Ma'am, that was the point I was also trying to make, because I said that it was Lakshmina Bajborua who was writing that Hadu, Buriya Hadu. It was not really the women who were writing. It was Lakshmina Bajborua, a male, who was actually compiling those stories and taking it out as a Buriya Hadu. So it's like, more of, production, and who is trying to control that. So that was the point I was trying to make.
So there's another question asking whether these are real voices of the subalterns. These can't be, because most of the writers, if I'm talking about Bengal, they come from so-called upper castes, and people who are considered to be the lower castes, quote unquote, were not allowed access to education. So if you're talking about written text and textuality, obviously these are not real voices, whatever you call it. Real voices of the subalterns can't be in the period that we're talking about. Now, anything else? We can take just one quick question before we round up. Anybody else? There was a hand, I think. If not, I think we will move on to the next session. And thank you so much, Bhaduri da, Nandini di, Sukalpa di, for your intervention. Okay, yeah. That is also Amrita Chakraborty. Yes, that has already been discussed by Nandini, that was a modernist print project, Thakumarjhuli. So thank you so much, all of you. It was really nice to have such a discussion on various fronts on International Working Women's Day. Thank you for your participation. And now over to the editors and contributors of this book. There'll be an interactive session, I believe. So Suranjana and Anirban, it's over to you.
And
Thank you, Maroona.
Thank you to all of you.
Thank you, Nandini. Thank you, Saugata and Sukalpa. And Saugata's forward was a precise, pointed, and brilliantly crafted one. Thank you. And the two other texts that we have, the articles we have, Nandini's and Sukalpa, a brilliant one. One is on autobiography, Rashundari Devi, and other is on sexual and feminine writing. So what was initially we were thinking about the act of writing as a resistance. When we were thinking about forming the book or the volume, we were actually thinking of writing as a kind of wounding the ground, as a kind of originary kind of thing, that ursprünglich, and at the same time the phenomenological process of writing as when discussing with the tutors, they're actually want to know about their how they negotiate with this kind of act of writing when they're doing with Dalit feminism, India's Northeast, or Indian feminism, or this kind of thing. So I'd like to hear from the contributors. Shamrata is here. Would you like to tell us something about how do you negotiate with the act of writing when you are working on Dalit feminism, particularly in this volume?
Anirban, can I be excused? I mean, I
yes,
have
yes, sure.
So Shamrat, I will hear this because it's being recorded. Right?
Yeah, sure, Nandini. It was nice listening to
and Sukalpa, bye-bye.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye, Maroona.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thank you, Anirban, and also Suranjana, for asking me to speak something on this panel, this interactive session. So I will not speak much and not eat upon the time of other people, but just 2-3 points which I have jotted down very quickly. First is on for the book which has been published, also to address the endeavor of the publisher, I should say at least something, because I've been working with Sachin for some time. I have also edited a couple of books with him, and I've grown up reading his books. And what is very significant is that, which also this discussion reflects, is Sachin's books, that is Worldview books, are not only student companions, but it is more than that. It is a kind of early initiation of a student into research. That is something very, very significant, and that comes very well in the discussions which are going on. And from that point of view, what I've tried to do in my essay is basically to connect, to give a research angle, a research twist, I should say, to the existing way of doing scholarship, as Nandini has done in her own way. Other people must have done. I have not read the book. It is yet to come. What I've tried to do is to engage with the notion of intersectionality. One way of addressing Dalit feminism is through the question of Brahminical patriarchy, to show how the question of caste and gender are something which are implicated by one another. And there is another way of addressing it through intersectionality, which is an extension of this. That is how this caste and gender questions, they come together, they intersect with one another. But what I've tried to do is that, that even the categories of gender and caste in an Indian context, in the subcontinental context, is actually constituted by one another. And there are gray areas where you cannot separate the caste question from the gender question. And that is very much evident from writing. Anirban has asked me a question on writing. To address that, two things are very important. One is literary writing, the other is memory writing. The structure of memory is something which is very similar to literature, because literature talks about strange coordinations, entanglements, which could not be categorized, which are quote-unquote non-binary. So the binary breaks down and a lot of factors come together, and that is very much evident from a Dalit woman's autobiography, or telling selves of Dalit women. I think it is very, very important. And I think that could be addressed through the question of, which I call entanglement of caste, gender, and many more, other factors as well. Mainly here, the question of caste and gender being entangled. And through that entangled reality can be expressed only through this pre-writing, this memory writing, but I would call that I have discussed in my essay. And another very important thing is to bring the experiences of women from that is the significant, because this is a collaborative work between me and Polidani Raut, and I think what the way she actually drew references from works which have not been published yet in English, like works by Shushila Thakbaure or Kaushalya Basantri, and that creates a horizon of overlapping scholarship, particularly scholarship which has not yet come in English. I think that is very important. And this, as Saugata started speaking on the overlapping of the different time zones in this book and also different cultures, I think that is very important to create the notion of the woman through various forms of women's writing, and that is not only creating an identity but also working through a constant difference. Thank you. I think I can speak this much right now. If there are other questions, it can be addressed. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So the forms of writing is very much important, and how do we negotiate, especially how women negotiate with this question, with these forms and the complexities and other modes of fashioning, and which is actually organic and attuned with it, the forms of fashioning and forms of writing. And one significant portion of the book is about India's Northeast. I would like to hear from Navnita-di. Would you like to tell us something about that you are writing about ecofeminist and India's Northeast in connection? Yes, Navnita-di, yes.
Thank you, Anirban, and thanks to Suranjana. It's been a pleasure to be a part of this book, particularly because it covers such a wide area of women's writing, as Professor Bhaduri has already mentioned, and also the fact that it takes into account the print medium of work, because most of the work here there is. I decided to write on Mamang Dai. When I thought of writing on Mamang Dai, one of the things that I thought I should be concentrating on is looking at her work as a form of resistance, because when we look at most of the research papers on Mamang Dai, we find that she is seen as a storyteller from Northeast, as someone who's trying to preserve a particular kind of lifestyle. But what I found lacking in the works on Mamang Dai is looking at her work from an ecofeminist perspective, and that I think is very important. And I look at it as a resistance because it becomes a resistance against the kind of life that we are moving into, or we are living in our everyday, all of us are living in. And that is why I felt that looking at Mamang Dai from this perspective would be important, as Professor Sukalpa Bhattacharjee also mentioned about Temsula Ao, and how she looks at land and the ways women are also involved in that kind of preserving of the land, and that all the thing I find is very particular to those women writing from the Northeast, and Mamang Dai also falls within that category. And another thing that I find is the way this lifestyle develops organically. I mean, I'm not using the word organic as a kind of brand, another form of branding and marketing of organicity that we have in the cities today, but as a kind of form of life that grows along with the local topography, a very localized form of nature, and which is looks at human beings as being a part of a larger world, as a part of nature, something which I find very common, and something that is very much present among the writers who are writing from the Northeast, and this is what I have tried to highlight in Mama in the work that I have in the essay that I have written on Mamang Dai, looking at her work from this both eco-feminist and eco-critical perspective, trying to locate her within these discourses, because I find somewhere literature also has a responsibility towards life, and that responsibility in in terms of preserving the nature, in terms of going back to the nature, reclaiming life as an organic whole, is something that is brought out by these works that we come across from authors like Mamang Dai, Sterling Kiret, and Sula Au, and many more. Thank you.
Thank you, Navanitari. So, as far as the book's sole concern, not sole, but the major concern is on the question of becoming, along with the figure of the category of the woman, and associated with it the question of unbecoming. That one of the essays actually deals with, that is on Mahasweta Devi. And when I was going through yesterday Macaulay's translation of Heidegger's Being and Time, and he was actually pointing out that how when you are translating Sein and Sein Dem, that being and entity, the difference between being and entity, then the question of being there is actually getting complex. So the idea of unbecoming, the phenomenological approach or phenomenological kind of suiciding of the self and vis-a-vis death, that kind of thing, that kind of question was emerging out. And one of the essays that on Mahasweta Devi is actually dealing with this question of unbecoming, and another portion which is also significant, that is the portion on Black feminism and the question of singing, the case birds singing, Maya Angelou and others. So I'd like to hear from Shivendu. Shivendu, there, would you like to say something writing on this question about dealing with the question of that becoming and resistance, all these kinds of thing in your paper on Maya Angelou? Are you there? Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah. Hi, Anirban. Thank you. Actually,
yes.
I got into a bit of this technical snag. I couldn't sort of unmute the entire thing. Anyway, what I wanted to show in my paper, the title as it goes is, it's about rethinking history, oppression, and memory as critical autobiography in Maya Angelou's poetry. Now, my take on Maya Angelou has been a kind of a transition from the notion of autobiographical writings that we find in her prose work, and a kind of a transition into my reading that designate a kind of idiom called critical autobiography. Now, what is critical autobiography? Critical autobiography is a way of looking at past experiences, the lived experiences, the trauma, the pain of existence, and trying to accommodate it as a factor of larger compendium of experiences that do not necessarily build up upon a kind of demarcation between a true story and a false story. Now, we know that Black feminism dealt with the notion of bringing about a kind of agency and power into the crevices of history that has been instrumental in dislocating the women's experiences and thereby marginalizing them. And Maya Angelou's life from the very beginning, as we have seen, is a kind of anticipated coordination of painful events strung together through episodic reincarnations. This is not about allocating different values and different means and modes of memory, thereby bringing about a kind of influx where the stories come to coalesce with what can be anticipated and incorporated into something more than memory. So, this is autobiographical memory. This is something that goes beyond the simple notion of autobiography and goes into the greater zones of apprehended notions of experiences finding themselves a shape of poetry. I would like to end with a few lines from the poem Equality. And since this is International Women's Day, this makes a lot of sense. And you announce my ways are wanton, that I fly from man to man, but I am just a shadow to you. Could you ever understand? We have lived a painful history. We know the shameful past, but I keep on marching forward and you keep on coming last. This is nothing but an autonoetic consciousness coming in random responses with the shards of historical ideas that get transformed into new ways of expressing oneself through words that form the contour of women's writing. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Shindu, thank you. So again, the eternal return to the wounds and inventing the other, and of course, the disruption of the symbolic that is again connected with women's writing that we are actually dealing with throughout the book, and resistance in terms of language. So finally, I would like to hear from Saugata if you would like to tell us something about resistance in terms of language and writing, or about these things about feminine writing, particularly as mode of resistance, and how a revolution can be possible, or the impossibility of revolution in terms of writing and language.
Yeah, sure, if you insist, if you absolutely insist, I surely can. Right from the beginning of this session, I mean, I have been emphasizing on the fact that this particular volume takes up writing as its primary objective, and that to writing which has been articulated in print, because that is, and I also, in response to one of Maroona's question, tried to underscore this very subversive, dangerous supplement that the writing always already is. In fact, when Debojyoti asked this question, I'm not very sure if Debojyoti is still around, as to how women have been the repository of oral narratives, and Nandini very nicely said that this essentialization of women unto orality, women unto naturality, women as being seen as this natural repository of organic oral narratives, which need not ever be really brought out into the domain of print or writing, that itself is a problematic presumption. So writing is precisely what we need to talk about, and women inserting themselves into the act of writing. And that writing in itself is not only a discourse through which you get to participate in maybe the global print capitalistic domain, or you deliberately can insert yourself beyond that essentialized domestic domain of private narratives being consumed and created, but unto, inserting oneself unto a public domain. But furthermore, writing, as we all know, is in itself a dangerous act. Even without, I mean, it becomes doubly dangerous and doubly subversive and doubly, therefore, potent as a tool of resistance when it comes to women's writing. But writing per se is this dangerous supplement. Writing per se is something that makes us exceed the here and now, the metaphysics of presence that I was talking about, of discourse being contingent upon only the simultaneity of our time and space, and becoming available unto a posterity, which without the traces of writing being there, the afterlife, because ultimately it's not that a particular discursive insertion brings once and for all the desired resistance and the desired change that is sought. There has to be an afterlife to the movement. There has to be a continuous, not just deferral, but a continuous sustenance of the movement. And that writing alone can really bring about. Now, within writing, and again, Sukalpa's article is precisely about that, and Sukalpa is still there. So, of course, writing by women itself has been theorized as being writing, being subversive insofar as it is writing, and yet, let's say, the writing being of a different order altogether, and wherein the point that Shivendu also made in terms of the body, what the body remembers, and what the body, therefore, itself, through its noetic memory, writes out. So, obviously, there is something specific about women's modes of writing, too. One, again, can say that much of Sixo's theorizations might lead to a certain kind of an essentialization of the woman necessarily writing not so logically, the woman necessarily writing incoherently, the woman necessarily writing not by participating or fully taking on the symbolic mode of language formation and writing, therefore, but rather writing her body, writing her amorphities, writing her illogicalities, writing her incoherences, writing the choral voice of the womb. These may be thought of as a bit of an essentialization, but I wouldn't think of it as essentialization, because not only has Derrida, again, in the idea of misonabine, or in the idea of this invaginated text, the idea of the text folding unto itself, within itself, this interiorization through a mode of writing is not the same kind of an essentialized interiorization that, in response to Debojyoti's question, Nandini was really talking against. This is an exteriorized interiorization. The double subversivity of women's writing that I referred to right at the beginning, writing in itself being a dangerous supplement, and it becoming even more dangerous, even more subversive in the hand of the women, precisely is because of this particular exteriorization, which writing by definition is, where obviously the discourse is not contained within that domestic private space alone, but reaches out to the public with an afterlife. And yet, an exteriorization that is invaginated in nature, that is interiorized in nature, that does write out the innards of one's very body unto, as Siksu would said, unto the paper. So this kind of a juxtaposition of an exteriorization that is interiorizing to begin with in nature makes women's writing even more subversive, even doubly subversive, and therefore doubly resistant. So participating in the institution of writing, coming out of the closet, as it were, inserting oneself into the public domain, as women writers have done, and taken on this entire courageous project, is something that we have to be really responsive to, while continuously understanding this double subversive, double-edged nature of the peculiarities and the specificities of women's writing. And therein can we find this build-up of a resistance that would never be foreclosed, a resistance that will forever take us to the to come, something that never will be resolved once and for all, and we being ushered into this nice world of gender equity or something. The idea is to keep that resistant edge alive forever towards a to come. And that is where women's writing once again scores, and that is where this volume scores. And with this, since Anirban asked me to say something, I would maybe close my comments. Thank you so much. And many
Thank you.
on Anirban and and Suranjana to have brought out this really, really, I mean, a very important book. Many congratulations.
Thank you, Shogotoda. Thank you for this kind of this comment that's coming out from the inside and operating from the outside, the precarious kind of symptom, and at the same time invagination. So, the final question to Shukalpadi, since she had written a special and there is the sexual and the feminine writing, lower creature feminine. So I would like to hear from Shukalpadi finally about feminine writing in terms of to calmness, that is a veneer about
Thank you very
the
much.
revolution impossible. And your final take, yes.
I think Shugata has wonderfully already summarized my paper. I would like to say that CISU, and for that matter, any discussion on women's writing should take into account that, number one, writing is an incomplete project. Writing is always an impossibility because writing is never to arrive at a fulfillment. Going back to the Derridian paradigm, that writing is always an eraser. So what we retrieve is only the traces of writing, not writing per se. So that is the basic paradigm on which. Secondly, why body? And why Sisu says more body, therefore more writing. Why? Because the body, first of all, the body as a text, which is actually a site on which patriarchal oppressive ideologies work, and therefore that is the place to begin one's own writing. Write with your body, write off the body, right? So writing off the body with the body, that brings in a larger question of how Sisu presumes that one could break the snare of silence. So one of the important projects of women's writing is, first of all, it's a transgressive act, because writing and women are oxymoron. Women are not supposed to write. A phallic act from which women have been kept away from for generations. And I think Virginia Woolf wonderfully in Room of One's Own summarizes this whole, why do we need to pay tribute to Afroben, the first woman who actually said that writing could be a means of earning one's own living. And not only that, the most crucial point is Afroben made mockery of the then existing themes of, a modesty, sexual modesty, also issues of virginity. These are the issues she actually attacked. And it is here at that level that we need to understand that women's writing being a transgressive act is always a question of transgressing the existing situation. Body is one of the agencies. Body is not the only agency. So the relationship between a pen and a body, if we go by the whole logic of how pen as a phallic entity, how women have tried over ages to transgress and break the snare of silence. So this is very important. Another thing about memory. Memory is also not a homogeneous act. Derrida once again says that memory always does a gardener's act. It sifts, it sorts. So what is produced by way, what Shomrat was talking about, that, autobiography is always a fictional text. There's no relationship sometimes between what one would like to say and why autobiographies are born. And if we go back to the history of autobiography once again, the male, you see, St. Augustine, Derrida, Roland Barthes, how they began thinking of an autobiography, how did it begin? And it is here that you find that it always has a triggering aspect. For women to write, for example, if you go by the Dalit autobiographical texts, and if you read it against Gopal Guru's article, Dalit women speak differently. Okay, so what is it that Dalit women want? And the reply that Sharmila Rege gave to Gopal Guru, that why Dalit women need to speak differently. So Dalit women feminisms, again, it's a plurality because we're talking of different shades of Dalit women. We're not talking of, so again and again, there is a problem of locating women and deconstructing the homogeneous category woman, which is to see her at interpersonal relationships, to see her in institutional spaces, to see her as someone who is transgressing. Therefore, writing always involves a transgressive act. She is not the angel, what Sandra Gilbert and Gilbert says, that a coming together of the demon, let's say the monster and the angel, the term that she uses. So you have the figure of a Medusa, you have a Kali, okay? You don't have the figure of an angelic person who is sitting down and writing. So memory is always to remember, is also to re-member. So how this membering happens in the memory is also not a very autonomous act. It happens in fragments. So it is very difficult for us to understand, to differentiate between women's personal narratives, women's writing, memoirs. There are several categories. And it is now for us to understand the various shades of writing which allow us to see women in different shades, different kinds of women telling different story. But that story is not about herself. In the context of Northeast, it's a story about the community. Also the question of unrepresentability. Okay, language cannot carry with it the essence of meaning. So if you go to Mamandai, if what Navanita was talking about, I thought she would mention about pensum. The whole idea of pensum in Mamandai is a huge task. It's a kind of an in-between. It is between orality and writability. It is between representability and unrepresentable. It is between the ecology and memory. So there is a huge contrast, these words, and why it is impossible to have an English word for pensum. That's also a question that we need to address. So writers of Northeast, you will find a lot of footnotes at the end. You see, for example, not only women writers, even male writers, the whole aspects, the question of unrepresentability, and also the traveling from one cultural universe into the other, how it happens, how language allows that movement to happen. Sometimes absence of language is that which is to be noted. The subtext is more important than the text. And this is how I think we need to read, texts written by women in different locations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sukalpadi. Thank you. So when it is with the question of feminine writing and the question of self-wielding of women, and we discussions will go on in terms of through the question of erasure, question of incompleteness, and question of death. So thank you, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and thank you, Nandini, though she is not here. Thank you, and thank you all our contributors. And Suranjana, would you like to say something? Yes.
Anirban, I have just one point to make.
Yes. Finally, with your point, come to the close.
That is just to supplement the very interesting discussion which is going on.
Yes.
I'd like to say, women's writing. One of the potentialities of writing is of course embodiment, the materiality of writing, which communicates with the materiality of the body who is writing, particularly in case of women. But the body is also haunted by the other bodies. So the body is not a singularity. As Sukalpadi has mentioned, the women who could not write or who could not represent them through writing. Just in my essay, I refer to, along with Baby Kamla, I refer to Kaushalya Basanti, who was writing about her grandmother. The grandmother could not represent herself. So the body of this woman who is writing is also haunted by the unrepresentable, absent, spectral body of the other, which is who could not come close to the Ambedkarite movement or to the political atmosphere in which the author is writing. And also the author who is writing at present is almost like a spectral voice, is embodying the other women who are writing later. So that is the point I wanted to make. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Shamradda. And instrumentalizing this undecided go on. Suranjana, finally, your vote of thanks.
Vote of thanks, I think already, Anirban, you have thanked everyone profusely, and I also, on behalf of this entire team, thank all of you. And that we started sharp at 7:30, and it's 9:34 now. It shows, I mean, it is a testimony to the relevance and pertinence of this discussion. We are really thankful to all our panelists and also our contributors for joining in, and also the rest of the participants for joining in, for giving their various inputs. We look forward to having such sessions all the more in near future. So I think we should wind up now. A very good night to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Maroona.